attention to what you're about to see. This is actual footage captured by a tourist on a beach in Morgan Bay, California. Watch closely. Those two figures in white hazmat suits, they're standing over what appears to be a body half buried in the sand. But look at the lower half. Those aren't legs. That's a tail. Iridescent purple and blue scales catching the light. Blonde hair spread across the wet sand like seaweed. The workers are frozen, unsure of what they've just uncovered. This footage was taken moments after construction crews made a discovery that would expose one of the most disturbing cases of scientific obsession and medical torture in American history. What they found wasn't a mythical creature. It was something far more terrifying. It was evidence of a nightmare that had been happening right under everyone's noses for years. You know that feeling when you're walking on the beach and you stumble across something unusual? Maybe a weird piece of driftwood or an interesting shell? For the construction crew working on the Morgan Bay Coastal Development Project in March 2017, what they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Morgan Bay is one of those postcard-perfect California coastal towns. Boutique coffee shops, art galleries, a university known for its marine biology program. The kind of place where parents send their kids because it feels safe, where young students come to study the ocean, to chase their dreams of saving the whales or discovering new species. 26-year-old Elena Martinez was one of those dreamers. Beautiful, brilliant, passionate about marine conservation. She'd grown up in Phoenix, Arizona, landlocked and fascinated by the ocean. Her bedroom walls had been covered with posters of dolphins and coral reefs. Her parents, Rosa and Miguel Martinez, had saved for years to send her to Redwood University in Morgan Bay to study marine biology. She would call us every Sunday, Rosa would later tell investigators, her voice breaking. She was so excited about her research. She talked about her advisor all the time, Dr. Marcus Webb. She said he was a genius. Elena had started her graduate program in September 2014, bright-eyed and eager. She was studying adaptive evolution in marine mammals, specifically looking at how certain species developed unique physiological traits to survive in extreme ocean environments. It was cutting-edge work, the kind of research that could make a career. But somewhere between her first year and her second, something changed. Her phone calls home became less frequent. When she did call, she sounded tired, distracted. She mentioned working late nights at the lab, assisting Dr. Webb with special projects that she couldn't discuss because they were confidential. I thought it was normal, Miguel said, tears streaming down his face. Graduate school is hard. I thought she was just stressed. On June 12, 2016, Elena's roommate reported her missing. She hadn't come home in 3 days. Her car was still in the university parking lot. Her laptop, phone, everything was in her apartment. It was like she'd simply vanished into thin air. The police investigated, of course. They questioned her friends, her professors, her advisor. Dr. Marcus Webb told them Elena had been struggling with her coursework, that she'd seemed depressed, that she'd mentioned taking a break from school. He was concerned, he said. He hoped she was okay. The case went cold. 9 months passed. Rosa and Miguel flew to Morgan Bay every few weeks, putting up flyers, begging anyone who'd seen their daughter to come forward. But Morgan Bay is a transient town, full of students and tourists. People disappear into new lives all the time. And then came that morning in March 2017, when everything changed. The construction crew had been hired to excavate a section of beach for a new seawall project. Morgan Bay had been experiencing severe coastal erosion, and the city council had approved emergency reinforcement work. It was supposed to be routine. Dig, pour concrete, stabilize the shoreline. Tommy Chen, the site foreman, had been running excavation projects for 15 years. He'd seen it all. Old trash, buried treasure from kids, occasionally some historical artifacts that required calling the county archaeologist. But nothing had prepared him for what his crew found that Tuesday morning. "We hit something solid about 3 feet down," Tommy later testified. "At first I thought it was a large piece of driftwood or maybe an old boat hull, but when we started clearing the sand away..." His voice trailed off in the deposition. Even months later, he couldn't finish the sentence without his hands shaking. What they'd found was a body, but not just any body. The lower half had been surgically modified, human legs replaced with what looked like an elaborate prosthetic tail covered in real scales, purple and blue, shimmering even in death. The upper body was preserved well enough that the blonde hair was still intact, woven through with synthetic fibers and what appeared to be kelp. A tourist, Jennifer Park from Seattle, had been walking her dog on the beach when she saw the commotion. She pulled out her phone and started recording. That footage, the same footage you saw at the beginning of this video, would become crucial evidence. "I thought they were filming a movie at first," Jennifer told reporters. "The hazmat suits, the body with the tail, it looked like a movie set. But then I saw one of the workers vomiting, and I realized this was real." Jennifer called 911. Within 20 minutes, the beach was swarming with police, forensic teams, and eventually the FBI. The body was carefully extracted and transported to the county medical examiner's office. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead medical examiner, had performed thousands of autopsies in her career. She'd seen murder victims, accident victims, decomposed bodies pulled from the ocean. But this was something entirely different. The level of surgical modification was extensive, Dr. Chen said in her official report, choosing her words carefully. The victim's legs had been amputated at the hip joint. A skeletal structure, possibly made from marine animal bones, had been surgically attached to create the framework for the tail. Real fish scales, later identified as various species including mahi-mahi and rainbow trout, had been grafted onto synthetic material that was then sutured to the remaining tissue. But here's what made it even more horrific. The surgery had been done while the victim was alive. The healing patterns in the bone and tissue indicated the victim had survived the initial procedures. For how long, Dr. Chen couldn't say, but long enough to suffer unimaginable pain. Dental records confirmed what investigators already suspected. This was Elena Martinez. The bright, beautiful graduate student who disappeared 9 months earlier had been turned into a grotesque experiment. The discovery sent shockwaves through Morgan Bay. Parents pulled their kids out of Redwood University. The local news ran the story 24/7, and everyone was asking the same question: who could do something like this? Detective Marcus Boyd had been with the Morgan Bay Police Department for 18 years. He'd worked homicides, missing persons, cold cases, but this was different. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was calculated, methodical, the work of someone with surgical knowledge and access to specialized equipment. "We knew pretty quickly we were looking for someone in the medical or scientific field," Boyd later explained. "The precision of the surgery, the types of materials used, the knowledge of anatomy required. This wasn't some random psychopath. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing." The investigation began with Elena's last known movements. Security footage from Redwood University showed her entering the Marine Sciences building on the evening of June 9, 2016, 3 days before she was reported missing. She was carrying her backpack and a coffee. She looked normal, happy even. She never left that building, at least not through any door covered by security cameras. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the entire Marine Sciences facility. It was a sprawling complex. Labs, offices, aquarium tanks, storage rooms, mechanical spaces. They brought in cadaver dogs, thermal imaging equipment, the works. What they found in the sub-basement would make national headlines. The sub-basement wasn't supposed to exist, not officially anyway. It wasn't on the building plans filed with the city. It wasn't listed on the university's facility maps. It was a hidden space, accessible only through a service elevator that required a special key card. Dr. Marcus Webb had that key card. When detectives descended into that underground laboratory, they found themselves in a scene straight out of a horror movie. Glass tanks lined the walls, most of them empty but some still containing things, tissue samples suspended in formaldehyde. What looked like human organs connected to monitoring equipment, and in the largest tank, still filled with seawater, were the decomposed remains of what had once been a human body, modified with marine animal parts. "There were surgical logs," Detective Boyd said, his voice hollow. detailed notes describing procedures, experiments. Dr. Webb had been documenting everything. He called it Project Siren. His goal was to create a human-marine hybrid, to prove that humans could be surgically adapted to live in the ocean. The logs contained names. Elena Martinez was Subject 7. There were 6 others before her, 6 young women who'd disappeared from the Morgan Bay area over the past decade, missing person cases that had gone cold. Students mostly. Young, bright women interested in marine biology. Webb had been hunting them through his position at the university, identifying promising students, gaining their trust as their academic advisor, luring them into his special research project. Once he had them in the sub-basement lab, they never left. The experimental procedures he performed were nightmarish. Forced hypothermia to adapt their bodies to cold water, surgical modifications to their respiratory systems, attempting to create artificial gills, amputations and grafts, trying to replace human limbs with marine animal parts. Most of his subjects died within weeks. Elena had survived for 4 months. But here's the thing that kept investigators up at night. Dr. Marcus Webb was considered a pillar of the community. He was 49 years old, married with 2 teenage children. He'd published dozens of papers on marine biology. He served on the city council's environmental committee. He donated to local charities. He coached youth soccer. Nobody suspected him, Boyd said. That's what made this so terrifying. He was hiding in plain sight, and he was good at it. Webb's wife, Catherine, claimed she had no idea what her husband was doing. She knew he worked long hours at the lab, sometimes sleeping there overnight when he had important experiments running. She knew he was passionate about his research. But torture? Murder? She insisted she never would have imagined it. The FBI got involved, bringing in behavioral analysts to try to understand Webb's psychology. What they pieced together was a portrait of a man who'd become increasingly obsessed with the idea of human evolution, specifically the theory that humans had once had an aquatic phase in their development. He believed he could prove the aquatic ape hypothesis through surgical intervention, explained Dr. Patricia Reeves, the FBI's lead behavioral analyst. In his mind, he wasn't committing crimes. He was conducting groundbreaking research. He saw his victims not as people, but as subjects, as the means to scientific immortality. Webb had been carefully building his underground lab for over 15 years. He'd started small, with animal experiments, fish, marine mammals, studying their physiology, learning their anatomy. Then he'd moved to larger mammals, trying to create hybrids. The university had no idea what was happening in their sub-basement because Webb had constructed it himself during a major renovation project in 2002. He'd redirected funding, forged permits, hired contractors who didn't ask questions. He was meticulous, Detective Boyd said. Every detail was planned. He had backup generators, air filtration systems, refrigeration for storing bodies and tissue samples. He'd thought of everything. The search of Webb's home revealed even more disturbing evidence. His personal computer contained thousands of images and videos documenting his experiments. Hours of footage showing the women in various stages of surgical modification. Audio recordings of their screams, their pleas for mercy. There were also writings, journal entries where Webb described his frustration when subjects died before he could complete his experiments, his excitement when he achieved minor breakthroughs, like successfully grafting scales onto human skin, his growing obsession with creating the perfect hybrid, one that could survive both on land and in the ocean. "I am close," he wrote in an entry dated May 2016, a month before Elena disappeared. "Subject 6 failed, but I understand now where I went wrong. The respiratory modifications must come before the skeletal restructuring. The next subject will be the one. I can feel it." The next subject was Elena. Webb had specifically targeted her because of her youth, her health, and her academic focus on adaptive evolution. In his twisted mind, she was the perfect candidate. She even looked the part. Blonde, slender, what he called siren-like in his notes. He'd drugged her coffee during one of their regular advisor meetings. When she became disoriented, he'd guided her to the service elevator, telling her he wanted to show her his special research facility. By the time Elena realized something was wrong, she was already strapped to a surgical table in the sub-basement. The sedatives and surgical logs indicated Webb had kept Elena alive for 129 days. During that time, he performed 23 separate surgical procedures on her. He amputated her legs. He attempted to modify her lungs. He grafted scales onto her skin. He documented every step, every cry, every moment of her suffering. When Elena finally died on October 16, 2016, from a combination of infection, organ failure, and surgical trauma, Webb preserved her body. He considered her his greatest achievement, even though she'd died before he could complete the final stages of his experiment. He'd buried her on the beach, in a location he could access easily. Sometimes, late at night, he would return to the burial site. Security footage later recovered showed him sitting alone on the sand, staring at the spot where Elena was buried, lost in his delusions. He thought he was on the verge of something revolutionary, Dr. Reeves explained. In his mind, Elena's death was a setback, not a tragedy. He was already planning his next subject. The manhunt for Dr. Marcus Webb began the moment investigators found the sub-basement lab. But Webb had already disappeared. He'd been tipped off, though investigators never determined exactly how. Some speculated he had contacts in the police department or university administration. Others thought he'd simply been monitoring security cameras and saw the police entering the building. Either way, by the time detectives went to arrest him, his house was empty. His car was in the driveway. His phone was on the kitchen counter, but Marcus Webb was gone. "We issued an APB immediately," Detective Boyd said. "We had his photos sent to every law enforcement agency in the country, airports, train stations, bus terminals, everywhere. We froze his bank accounts, tracked his credit cards, but he'd prepared for this. He had cash hidden somewhere, probably fake IDs. He knew how to disappear." The FBI assembled a task force. They analyzed Webb's writings, his communications, trying to predict where he might go. His journal entries suggested he had fantasies about escaping to a remote island, continuing his experiments away from small-minded authorities. But those were just fantasies. In reality, Webb needed access to medical equipment, sedatives, surgical supplies. He couldn't just vanish into the wilderness. Meanwhile, the families of the other 6 victims were being notified. The DNA from the remains in Webb's lab was being analyzed, cross-referenced with missing person cases. One by one, the victims were identified. Jessica Palmer, 24, disappeared in 2007. She'd been an undergraduate marine biology student, passionate about shark conservation. Subject 1. Aisha Robinson, 22, disappeared in 2009. She'd come to Redwood University on a scholarship, first-generation college student, dreaming of becoming a marine veterinarian. Subject 2. Nicole Chen, 25, disappeared in 2010, PhD candidate studying bioluminescence in deep-sea creatures. Subject 3. Samantha Torres, 23, disappeared in 2012. Graduate student researching climate change impacts on coral reefs. Subject 4. Rachel Kim, 26, disappeared in 2014. Postdoctoral researcher studying marine mammal cognition. Subject 5. Lily Anderson, 24, disappeared in 2015. Master's student focusing on sustainable aquaculture. Subject 6. 7 young women. 7 brilliant minds. 7 lives stolen by a man they'd trusted as a mentor and advisor. The notification process was devastating for the families. Jessica Palmer's parents, Carol and David, had spent 10 years believing their daughter might still be alive somewhere, maybe suffering from amnesia, maybe starting a new life. They'd never given up hope. Learning the truth, that she'd been dead since 2007, that she'd been tortured and mutilated, shattered them completely. "We always thought we'd get a phone call one day," Carol said, her voice distant and hollow. She'd call and say, "Mom, Dad, I'm sorry I worried you. I'm okay." We held on to that for 10 years. And now? The Robinsons, Aisha's family, had a similar story. Aisha had been their pride and joy, the first in their family to go to college. Her father had worked 2 jobs to help pay for her education. When she disappeared, they'd hired private investigators, spent their life savings trying to find her. "We thought maybe she'd been kidnapped for ransom," Aisha's father, Marcus Robinson, said. "Or maybe she'd gotten mixed up with the wrong people. We never imagined this. We never imagined someone at her university, someone who was supposed to be teaching her, would—" He couldn't finish. The words were too painful. The news coverage was relentless. Every major network ran the story. CNN dedicated entire segments to analyzing how Webb had evaded detection for so long. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Morgan Bay became synonymous with horror. The university's Wikipedia page was edited to include a section on the Morgan Bay mermaid murders. Parents across the country started questioning whether their children were safe at university. Medical ethicists debated how Webb's experiments had gone undetected for so long. How had he ordered surgical equipment without raising red flags? How had he constructed an entire laboratory without anyone noticing? How had the university's oversight committees missed this? The scientific community was in shock. Professional organizations released statements condemning Webb's actions. Some institutions began reviewing their own research protocols, worried about what might be happening in their own facilities. Redwood University faced enormous scrutiny. How had Webb constructed an entire hidden laboratory without anyone noticing? How had he ordered surgical equipment and medical supplies without raising red flags? How had 7 women disappeared while working with the same professor without anyone connecting the dots? The university president, Dr. Harold Chen, held a press conference 5 days after Elena's body was discovered. He looked haggard, defeated. The bags under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept since the news broke. "We are cooperating fully with law enforcement," he said, his voice shaking. "We are conducting our own internal investigation. We are committed to ensuring this never happens again. But I know that's not enough. 7 families lost their daughters while those young women were under our care. There are no words adequate to express our grief and our shame." The press conference didn't go well. Reporters shouted questions. Parents of current students demanded answers. How could the university not know about a hidden laboratory in their own building? Why hadn't anyone noticed a pattern when multiple students working with the same professor went missing? Dr. Chen tried to explain that the disappearances had occurred over a decade, that they'd happened in different years, that there was no obvious pattern at the time, but his explanation sounded hollow. 7 women, 7 missing person cases, all connected to the same professor. How had no one seen it? The truth was more complicated. Universities are large, complex organizations. Students come and go. Graduate students especially. They're transient, often isolated, working odd hours. When one disappears, it's tragic, but not necessarily suspicious. They could have dropped out, transferred, left academia entirely. It happens. And Webb had been careful. He never took more than 1 student every year or 2. He varied his methods of disposal. He created alibis, established patterns of behavior that made him seem concerned and helpful when his students went missing. He'd even helped organize search parties for some of his victims, playing the role of the worried mentor perfectly. He was a master manipulator, Dr. Reeves, the FBI behavioral analyst, explained. He understood human psychology, institutional dynamics, how to exploit gaps in oversight. He'd studied not just marine biology, but also how to get away with murder. Lawsuits were filed almost immediately. The families of the victims sued the university for negligence, for failing to protect their daughters, for creating an environment where a predator could operate freely for over a decade. The legal arguments were complex. What duty does a university owe to its students? How much oversight is reasonable? Where does academic freedom end and institutional responsibility begin? The university's lawyers argued that Webb had hidden his crimes expertly, that no reasonable oversight system could have detected what was happening in a secret, off-the-books laboratory. But the family's attorneys countered that the pattern of disappearances should have triggered some investigation, that the university had failed in its basic duty of care. The lawsuits would drag on for years, but eventually the university would settle for undisclosed amounts rumored to be in the tens of millions of dollars. But no amount of money could bring those young women back. Rosa and Miguel Martinez were destroyed. Their only daughter, their bright shining star, had suffered unimaginable torture before dying alone in a basement laboratory. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't eat. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw Elena's face, imagined her pain, her fear, her desperate hope that someone would save her. "I keep thinking about her last moments," Rosa said in an interview, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did she know we were looking for her? Did she think we'd given up? Did she die believing we'd abandoned her?" Miguel had his own torment. "We were supposed to protect her," he said, his voice raw. "That's what parents do. We protect our children, and we sent her across the country to a place we thought was safe. We trusted that university. We trusted that professor. And look what happened." The guilt was eating them alive. They'd encouraged Elena to pursue her dreams. They'd been proud when she got into Redwood University. They'd told her Dr. Webb sounded like a wonderful mentor. Every decision they'd made, with love, with the best intentions, had led their daughter into the hands of a monster. The psychological toll on the investigators was severe too. Detective Boyd started having nightmares, waking up in cold sweats, seeing Elena's modified body in his dreams. The crime scene techs who'd processed Webb's lab were offered counseling. Many of them took it. Some left law enforcement entirely, unable to continue after seeing what human beings were capable of doing to each other. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Chen, took a 3-month leave of absence after completing the autopsies. "You can't unsee what we saw," she said later. "You can't unknow what we learned about what he did to those women. It changes you. It changes how you see the world, how you see people. I had to step back, had to remember that most people are good, that what we saw was an aberration." While the world reeled from the discovery, the FBI task force was working around the clock to find Webb. They tracked down every associate, every colleague, every person who'd ever worked with him. They interviewed his wife and children extensively, looking for any hint of where he might have gone. Catherine Webb was cooperative but devastated. She'd been married to Marcus for 23 years. She'd shared a bed with him, raised children with him, built a life with him, and she'd had no idea what he was doing in that laboratory. "I keep going over everything in my mind," she told investigators, "looking for signs I missed, but there was nothing. He was a good husband, a good father. He came home for dinner most nights. He helped with homework. He attended our kids' school events. How could someone like that be what he was?" The investigators believed her. There was no evidence Catherine had any knowledge of Webb's crimes. She'd been as deceived as everyone else. But that knowledge didn't make her situation any easier. She was now the wife of one of the most notorious killers in American history. Her children were the children of a monster. Their lives were destroyed by association. 3 weeks into the manhunt, they got their first major break. A security camera at a truck stop in Nevada captured footage of a man matching Webb's description purchasing gas and food. He was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, but the facial recognition software flagged it as a 78% match. The FBI descended on Nevada, interviewing everyone at the truck stop, pulling security footage from every camera in a 50-mile radius. They found his trail: gas stations, convenience stores, cheap motels. He was heading east, away from the coast, into the desert. "That surprised us initially," Boyd said. "We'd assumed he'd stay near water, given his obsession with the ocean, but then we realized he was trying to disappear. The desert is a good place to vanish if you know what you're doing." More sightings came in over the following weeks. A gas station attendant in Arizona remembered a quiet man who'd paid cash and avoided eye contact. A motel clerk in New Mexico recalled a guest who'd checked in late and left before dawn, never making eye contact, never engaging in small talk. "He was good at evading capture," admitted FBI Special Agent Lisa Torres, who led the manhunt. "He never stayed anywhere longer than one night. He avoided major cities. He changed his appearance frequently, grew a beard, dyed his hair, wore different glasses. We'd get close, and he'd slip away." The FBI put together a psychological profile, trying to predict Webb's next move. Where would he go? What would he do? The profilers believed Webb was struggling with his new reality. For 15 years, He'd been living a double life, respected professor by day, torturer, murderer by night. Now he was just a fugitive, separated from his lab, his equipment, his research. "We theorized he was experiencing a kind of withdrawal," Dr. Reeves explained. "His experiments had become his identity. Without them, who was he? We thought he might try to establish a new laboratory somewhere, or at least try to continue his research in some form." They were right. In late April 2017, a librarian in Amarillo, Texas, noticed something unusual. A man had been spending hours in the library's reference section, reading medical journals and anatomy textbooks. He had a beard and wore thick-framed glasses, but something about him seemed off. He was taking notes in a notebook, drawing detailed anatomical diagrams, muttering to himself about respiratory modification protocols. The librarian, whose name was Margaret Flynn, was a true crime enthusiast. She'd been following the Morgan Bay mermaid case obsessively, reading every article, watching every news segment. Something about this man triggered her instincts. She approached him, asked if he needed help finding anything. He looked up at her, and for just a second, she saw something in his eyes. A flash of... what? Fear? Calculation? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a polite smile. "No, thank you," he said. "Just doing some research." But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling. After he left that day, she looked at what he'd been reading. Medical journals about surgical techniques, anatomy textbooks focused on skeletal structures, books about marine biology and aquatic adaptation. She called the police. They came, took her statement, but by the time they arrived, the man was long gone. They told her it was probably nothing, but they'd keep an eye out. Margaret couldn't let it go. The next day, she reviewed the library's security footage. She saw the man entering, saw him sitting at the table, saw him writing in his notebook. She took screenshots, enhanced them as much as she could on her personal computer. Then she compared them to photos of Dr. Marcus Webb that had been circulating in the news. The beard was new, the glasses were different, the hair was darker, but the eyes were the same. She called the FBI hotline this time, bypassing local police. Within 2 hours, FBI agents were at her library. They reviewed the footage, confirmed what Margaret suspected. That was Marcus Webb. "Ms. Flynn," Agent Torres told her, "you may have just helped us catch one of the most dangerous men in America." The manhunt intensified. FBI agents flooded Amarillo, showing Webb's photo at every hotel, motel, gas station, and restaurant. They needed to find him before he disappeared again. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Webb had made a critical mistake. He'd left his notebook on the library table when he left. Margaret had found it and turned it over to the FBI. Inside were not just anatomical drawings, but also journal entries. Even on the run, separated from his laboratory, Webb couldn't stop thinking about his experiments. He was still obsessed, still planning, still convinced he could complete his work if he could just find the right subject. "I was so close with Subject 7, he wrote. "If I'd had more time, if I'd adjusted the dosage of immunosuppressants, if I'd waited longer between surgical stages, she could have survived. She could have been the proof the world needed." The notebook also contained something crucial. A receipt from a motel in Amarillo, dated that morning. The Desert Rose Inn, room 14. The FBI moved quickly but carefully. They couldn't risk Webb harming himself or anyone else. They surrounded the motel, evacuated the nearby rooms quietly, established a perimeter. Agent Torres led the tactical team. They approached room 14 at 6:47 p.m. on April 28, 2017. She knocked on the door, identified herself as FBI. No answer. She knocked again. "Dr. Webb, we know you're in there. We need you to come out with your hands visible." Movement inside. The sound of something crashing. Then footsteps running toward the back of the room. "Breach!" Torres ordered. The tactical team kicked in the door. Webb was trying to escape through the bathroom window, his body half in and half out. They pulled him back inside, handcuffed him, secured the scene. The room was disturbing. Webb had transformed it into a makeshift laboratory. He'd stolen medical equipment from somewhere: scalpels, forceps, suture kits, bottles of sedatives and antibiotics, probably purchased on the black market, surgical gloves, antiseptic, sterile drapes. On the bed were photographs, not of his victims, but of potential new subjects, women he'd been stalking online, identifying through marine biology forums and social media groups, young women, students, fitting the same profile as his previous victims. He was already planning his next victim, Agent Torres said, disgust clear in her voice. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't felt remorse. In his mind, he was just in between projects. Webb fought and screamed as they arrested him. "You don't understand," he kept shouting. "I'm on the verge of a breakthrough. History will vindicate me. Darwin, Galileo, they were all persecuted for their ideas. You're making a mistake." He was extradited back to California to face charges. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The bodies in his lab, the surgical logs, the videos, the journal entries, the testimony of dozens of witnesses. His defense attorney, a public defender named Richard Martinez, no relation to Elena, knew it was a nearly impossible case. Martinez tried to argue insanity. He brought in psychiatrists who testified that Webb suffered from a delusional disorder, that he genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate scientific research and couldn't distinguish right from wrong. They painted a picture of a man who'd descended into madness, consumed by his obsession. But the prosecution had something powerful: premeditation. Webb's planning, his construction of the hidden lab, his careful selection of victims, his methods of evading detection, all of it demonstrated he knew what he was doing was wrong and went to great lengths to hide it. "I must be more careful with Subject 5, he'd written in 2014. "I nearly made a critical error by disposing of her personal effects too close to the university. The police are not completely incompetent. I cannot afford to be careless." That shows consciousness of guilt. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park, no relation to the tourist Jennifer Park, argued, he knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew it was criminal. He simply didn't care. The trial began in September 2017. It lasted 6 weeks. Every day, the courtroom was packed with media, families of victims, curious onlookers. Security was tight. There had been death threats against Webb, concerns that someone might try to attack him in court. Rosa and Miguel Martinez attended every single day, sitting in the front row, staring at the man who'd murdered their daughter. They never spoke to him, never acknowledged him beyond their silent, devastating presence. "I wanted him to see us," Rosa said. "I wanted him to see the pain he'd caused. I wanted him to know that Elena wasn't just Subject 7. She was our daughter. She was a person who was loved." The trial revealed even more horrifying details than had been made public. The prosecution presented the video evidence, showing Elena on the surgical table, conscious, screaming, showing the other victims in various stages of their ordeals. The jury was visibly shaken. Several members were crying. One had to leave the courtroom. Webb showed no emotion throughout. He sat quietly, taking notes, occasionally whispering to his attorney. When the prosecution presented the video evidence, Webb watched with what appeared to be clinical detachment, as if he were observing someone else's work. "That was the most chilling part," Detective Boyd testified, his complete lack of empathy. He looked at those videos the way a chef might critique another chef's technique. There was no recognition that he was watching a human being suffer. The defense called their psychiatric experts, who testified about Webb's mental state, his delusions, his obsessive personality disorder. They argued he was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions, that in his mind he was conducting important research. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They brought in their own psychiatrists, who testified that while Webb might be obsessed, he was not insane in the legal sense. He knew right from wrong. He knew his actions were criminal. He chose to do them anyway. The breakthrough in understanding the full scope of Webb's crimes came when forensic analysts discovered encrypted files on his computer. It took weeks to crack the encryption, but what they found inside was devastating. Webb had been planning this for far longer than anyone realized. The earliest files dated back to 1998, nearly 20 years before his arrest. Back then, he was a young professor, recently hired by Redwood University, already obsessed with the idea of human-marine hybrids. The files contained research proposals he'd submitted to various medical and scientific institutions, all of them rejected. Detailed plans for surgical experiments that would prove the viability of human aquatic adaptation. Grant applications that were turned down with comments like ethically unconscionable and scientifically unsound. One rejection letter from the National Institutes of Health dated 1999 was particularly blunt. Dr. Webb, the experiments you propose would constitute torture under both national and international law. The surgical modifications you describe would cause severe, prolonged suffering with no medical benefit to the subjects. This proposal is rejected, and we strongly urge you to seek professional help regarding your fixation on this research direction. Webb had kept every rejection letter. In the margins, he'd written notes. They don't understand. Small minds. History will prove them wrong. He'd been trying to get legitimate funding for his experiments for years, explained Dr. Patricia Reeves, the FBI behavioral analyst. When every institution rejected him, when the scientific community dismissed his ideas as pseudoscience and butchery, he decided to pursue his research anyway, in secret. The trial revealed Webb's methodology in excruciating detail. He'd used his position as an academic advisor to identify vulnerable students, often those who were far from home without strong local support networks, deeply passionate about marine biology. He'd groomed them over months, earning their trust, positioning himself as a mentor who could help them achieve their dreams. Then would come the invitation to work on a special project, confidential research that could make their careers, something they couldn't tell anyone about because it was so groundbreaking that competitors might steal the idea. Jessica Palmer, his first victim, had been so excited about the opportunity. Her journal, found in her apartment years after her disappearance, contained an entry from August 2007. Dr. Webb asked me to help with a classified research project. He says I have the perfect skills and that my understanding of evolutionary adaptation is exactly what he needs. This could be my big break. I can't believe he chose me out of all his students. 3 days later, she was strapped to a surgical table in the sub-basement. 2 weeks after that, she was dead. With each victim, Webb refined his techniques, both surgical and psychological. He learned how to keep his subjects alive longer, how to manage infections, how to minimize blood loss during amputations. He also learned how to better manipulate his victims, how to keep them compliant through a combination of drugs and psychological conditioning, how to prevent them from fighting back. He was getting better at it, Detective Boyd said grimly during his testimony. Not just the surgery, but the entire process. Elena survived 129 days. Jessica, his first victim, only lasted 11. He was learning from each experiment, refining his methods. If we hadn't caught him when we did, who knows how long his next victim might have suffered. The evidence that proved crucial in court was the footage itself, both the video recordings Webb had made of his experiments and the cell phone footage captured by Jennifer Park on the beach that day. Remember that footage from the beginning of this video? The tourist recording the workers in hazmat suits standing over Elena's body? That footage became Exhibit 1A in the prosecution's case. It showed the crime scene exactly as it was discovered, before any contamination or questions about evidence tampering could arise. The prosecutor played it for the jury, explaining its significance. This is the moment, she said, when Dr. Webb's crimes were finally exposed. After 15 years of torture and murder, after 7 young women lost their lives in the most horrific ways imaginable, this is the moment when it all came to light. But here's something most people don't know. Investigators later discovered that Webb had been present when Elena's body was found. He'd been on the beach that morning, watching from a distance, when the construction crew made their discovery. Security footage from a nearby beach cafe captured him standing on the boardwalk, about 100 yards away from the excavation site. The timestamp showed 7:23 a.m., just minutes after the construction crew started uncovering the body. He was just standing there, watching, not running away, not trying to hide, just watching. Witnesses reported seeing a middle-aged man who seemed intensely focused on the commotion, who didn't leave even when the police arrived, who stood there for nearly an hour just staring at the scene. He wanted to see their reaction, Dr. Reeves explained during her testimony. He wanted to witness the moment when the world saw his work. It was a form of validation for him, a way to experience the impact of what he'd created. Even if they couldn't appreciate the scientific merit, he wanted them to see what he'd accomplished. He wanted to see the shock, the horror, the recognition that something extraordinary had been done. The prosecution also presented the hazmat suits found in Webb's lab, the same style and brand worn by the workers in the beach footage. Webb had purchased them specifically for handling his subjects, to protect himself from infection and contamination during and after the surgical procedures. But here's the chilling part. Webb had actually considered staging the discovery himself, dressing in one of those suits and finding Elena's body, so he could control the narrative around his work. His journal from February 2017, just 1 month before the actual discovery, contained a detailed entry about this plan. Perhaps it's time for Subject 7 to be discovered. I could present her as a found specimen, claim she washed ashore during a storm. I could be the one to make the discovery, calling it in as a concerned citizen. The medical community would be forced to examine her to acknowledge the sophistication of the surgical modifications. They would have to admit this is possible. They would have to see that I was right all along. He'd written out the entire scenario, what he would wear, what he would say, how he would react when authorities arrived. He'd planned it like a scene in a movie, choreographing every detail. But ultimately, he'd decided against it. "Too risky," he wrote. "Better to let her be found naturally. The shock will be greater, the impact more profound." So he'd waited. And when the construction crew started their excavation project, when he saw them digging near Elena's burial site, he knew it was only a matter of time. That's why he was there that morning. Not to stop the discovery, but to witness it. The testimony of the medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Chen, was particularly damning. She walked the jury through her autopsy findings in meticulous detail, explaining exactly what had been done to Elena's body and what it meant. The amputation of both legs was performed with surgical precision, Dr. Chen testified, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she displayed photographs that made several jury members look away. He used a medical-grade bone saw, the kind used in operating rooms for orthopedic surgeries. The cuts were clean, precise, suggesting he took his time and had considerable skill. This was not the work of an amateur. She explained how, after amputation, Webb had attached a skeletal framework made from multiple marine animal bones, shark vertebrae, dolphin ribs, and what they believed was whale bone, using surgical screws, titanium plates, and wire. The engineering was actually quite sophisticated, Dr. Chen continued, and her use of the word sophisticated to describe such horror made the jury shift uncomfortably. He'd studied marine animal anatomy extensively. He knew how their skeletons were structured, how they moved, how they supported weight in water versus on land. He was trying to replicate that structure in his victims. She explained how the scales had been harvested from multiple fish species, preserved, and then grafted onto synthetic material made from medical-grade silicone. This material was then sutured directly to Elena's flesh using techniques typically used in burn victim skin grafts. "We found evidence of over 200 individual sutures," Dr. Chen said, "each one placed with care, with precision. This wasn't done quickly. This took hours, possibly days of work." The respiratory modifications were equally horrifying. Webb had made incisions in Elena's neck, attempting to create structures that would function like gills. He'd inserted tubes into her trachea, trying to create pathways for water to flow through. None of it worked, of course. Human physiology can't be fundamentally altered through surgery. But Webb had tried anyway, documenting each failure, adjusting his approach, trying again. He'd also injected various substances into her bloodstream, Dr. Chen explained. "We found traces of compounds designed to increase blood oxygen capacity, similar to those used by deep-sea divers. He was trying to make her blood more efficient at carrying oxygen, presumably so she could hold her breath longer underwater." The torture had been systematic, methodical, ongoing, and through it all, Webb had kept detailed notes, treating Elena's suffering as scientific data. Every procedure was documented in his logs, Dr. Chen continued, her voice finally starting to break. He noted her vital signs, her responses to different drugs, the progression of infections, her level of consciousness during procedures. He even noted her emotional state, whether she was crying, whether she was begging, whether she'd stopped fighting. He treated her suffering as data points in his research. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. Rosa Martinez had her face buried in her husband's shoulder. Miguel stared straight ahead, tears streaming down his face, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might break. The jury was visibly shaken. Several members were crying openly. One juror, a middle-aged woman with a daughter in college, had to request a break. She couldn't continue listening without composing herself. Webb's defense team tried their best. They called their psychiatric experts, who testified about Webb's obsessive personality disorder, his grandiose delusions, his inability to recognize the humanity of his victims. Dr. Raymond Phillips, a forensic psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, took the stand for the defense. Dr. Webb suffers from what we call a delusional disorder with grandiose features, he explained. He genuinely believes he is on the verge of a scientific breakthrough that will revolutionize our understanding of human evolution. In his mind, the suffering he inflicted was regrettable, but necessary for the advancement of science. But the prosecution countered with Webb's own words, reading from his journals, showing that he explicitly acknowledged the illegality and immorality of his actions. Listen to what he wrote in 2011, prosecutor Jennifer Park said, reading from one of Webb's journals. I know what I'm doing would be condemned by the medical establishment. I know they would call it torture, call it murder. But great scientists have always been misunderstood by their contemporaries. Galileo was imprisoned. Darwin was mocked. I will be vindicated by history, even if I must operate in the shadows now. That's not delusion, Park argued, turning to face the jury. That's calculated awareness. He knew it was wrong by society's standards. He knew it was illegal. He knew he would be punished if caught. He simply believed his work was more important than the lives of 7 young women. That's not insanity. That's evil. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned to the courtroom, you could feel the tension. Every seat was filled. News cameras lined the back wall. The families of the victims held hands, barely breathing. The 4-person stood. On the count of first-degree murder of Jessica Palmer, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of first-degree murder of Aisha Robinson, how do you find? Guilty. One by one, for all 7 victims, the verdict was the same. Guilty. 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 The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in sobs. Rosa Martinez collapsed in her seat. Miguel held her, his shoulders shaking. Around them, other families wept, holding each other, finally hearing the word they'd been waiting for. Webb showed no reaction. He sat perfectly still, his face blank, as if the verdict meant nothing to him, as if he were above it all. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later, in November 2017. Before the judge handed down the sentence, the families of the victims were allowed to give impact statements. Rosa Martinez spoke for nearly 20 minutes. She'd prepared her statement carefully, written it out, revised it dozens of times. But when she stood at the podium, looking at Webb for the first time since the verdict, she barely glanced at her notes. She talked about Elena as a little girl, playing in their backyard in Phoenix, fascinated by the tadpoles in a bucket of water, how Elena would spend hours watching them, asking questions about how they breathed, how they would transform. She talked about Elena's first trip to the ocean at age 7, how her eyes had lit up when she felt the waves, how she'd stood in the water giggling as fish darted around her ankles and said, "Mama, I want to live in the ocean forever." "You made that happen, didn't you?" Rosa said, her voice breaking as she looked at Webb. "You made her part of the ocean, but not the way she dreamed, not the way any child should dream." She talked about the daughter she'd lost and the unimaginable suffering Elena had endured. The 129 days of torture, the 23 surgeries, the pain, the fear, the hopelessness. "You stole her from us," Rosa said, tears streaming down her face. "You stole her dreams, her future, her life. You stole our peace. You stole our ability to trust, to feel safe, to exist in this world without fear. Every day we wake up knowing what you did to our baby girl. Every day we live with that horror. And you feel nothing." Webb stared straight ahead, expressionless. Miguel spoke next, his voice raw and broken. He talked about working 2 jobs to save for Elena's education, about how proud he'd been when she got into Redwood University, about the last phone call they'd had before she disappeared. "She told me she loved me," Miguel said. "She said, 'Papa, I'll make you proud.' And I said, 'You already do, mija. You already do.' Those were the last words we ever spoke. I didn't know she was already in your basement. I didn't know you'd already taken her. I didn't know my daughter was dying while I was telling her how proud I was." The other families gave similar statements. Jessica Palmer's mother talked about the 10 years of not knowing, the hope that gradually faded, the desperate search that consumed their lives. Aisha Robinson's father talked about his daughter's dreams, how she wanted to become a veterinarian, how she would have saved lives instead of losing her own. Nicole Chen's sister talked about missing her best friend, about growing up without her. Each statement was a knife to the heart. Each one revealed the ripple effects of Webb's crimes, not just the 7 young women who died, but the dozens of people who loved them, whose lives were forever shattered. When they were finished, the judge spoke. Her name was Justice Margaret Reynolds, and she was a veteran of the criminal justice system, had presided over countless murder trials, but even she seemed shaken by this case. "Dr. Webb," she said, her voice cold and precise, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered crimes of such calculated cruelty. You used your position of trust to prey on young women who admired you, who sought your guidance. You subjected them to unimaginable torture over extended periods of time. You documented their suffering with clinical detachment, and even after your arrest, you have shown no remorse whatsoever." She sentenced him to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 175 years for the other charges: kidnapping, torture, unlawful imprisonment, abuse of corpses, practicing medicine without proper authorization. "You treated these young women as though they were less than human," Justice Reynolds said, her voice rising with controlled anger. "And so, you will spend the rest of your life in a cage, with no freedom, no dignity, no hope. You will never see the ocean again. You will never conduct another experiment. You will grow old and die alone, forgotten by everyone except the families whose lives you destroyed. May you have many years to contemplate what you've done, though I suspect you will remain as unmoved by your own suffering as you were by theirs." Webb was led away in shackles. He never looked at the families, never acknowledged their pain. To the very end, he remained emotionally void, as if he couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. In the years since, the impact of the Morgan Bay mermaid case has reverberated through multiple systems and institutions. Rosa and Miguel Martinez have become powerful advocates for missing persons' families and for better oversight of university research laboratories. They established the Elena Martinez Foundation in 2018, which provides support for families of missing students, funds search efforts, and lobbies for stricter regulations around academic research involving human subjects. The foundation has helped locate 17 missing students and has successfully pushed for legislation in California requiring universities to conduct annual audits of all research facilities, including those operated by individual professors. "We can't bring Elena back," Rosa said in a 2020 interview, her voice stronger now, tempered by years of advocacy work. "We can't undo what happened to her or to the other 6 young women, but we can try to prevent it from happening to someone else's daughter. We can fight to make sure that predators like Webb can't hide behind academic credentials and institutional prestige. That's what keeps us going. That's Elena's legacy." Redwood University underwent massive, painful reforms. The entire marine sciences building was gutted and renovated, with every space accounted for and accessible to university administration. The sub-basement where Webb conducted his experiments was filled in with concrete, sealed forever. New protocols were implemented requiring research oversight, with regular inspections of all laboratories, review of all equipment purchases over a certain dollar amount, and mandatory reporting of any concerns by staff or students. Anonymous hotlines were established for students who felt uncomfortable with their advisors or research projects. Counseling services were expanded, but the damage to the university's reputation was catastrophic and perhaps irreversible. Enrollment dropped by 40% in the years following the case. Several prominent professors left for other institutions, not wanting to be associated with Redwood. The school's prestigious marine biology program, once ranked among the top 5 in the nation, struggled to attract students. Who would want to study marine biology at the university where the Morgan Bay mermaid murders happened? The university eventually changed its name in 2021, becoming Pacific Coastal University, hoping to distance itself from the horrific legacy. But everyone still knows what it is, what happened there. Jennifer Park, the tourist who recorded the footage on the beach that day, struggled with what she'd witnessed. She started having nightmares, panic attacks, simple things, seeing someone in a hazmat suit, walking on a beach, even seeing fish at a grocery store, could trigger intense anxiety. "I was just walking my dog," she said in a 2019 interview, her voice still shaky. "I was on vacation, enjoying the morning, and then suddenly I was in the middle of that image of that woman's body, what had been done to her, the workers standing there not knowing what to do. I still see it when I close my eyes. I've been in therapy for 2 years now. It helps, but I don't think I'll ever fully process what I saw." The construction workers who discovered Elena's body were all offered counseling through their employer. Some took advantage of it, others didn't. Tommy Chen, the foreman, eventually changed careers entirely. "I couldn't do it anymore," he admitted in a rare interview in 2020. "Every time I dug into sand or soil, I'd think about what we found that day. I'd wonder if there were others buried out there, other victims we didn't know about. I ended up becoming a truck driver. It's not glamorous, but at least I'm not digging up bodies." Morgan Bay itself slowly recovered, but the case left a permanent scar on the community. The beach where Elena was found became an unofficial memorial. People left flowers, candles, written tributes. Tourists would stop there, pay their respects. Eventually, in 2019, the city installed a formal memorial, a bench overlooking the ocean with a bronze plaque honoring all 7 victims. The inscription reads, "In memory of Jessica, Aisha, Nicole, Samantha, Rachel, Lily, and Elena. Brilliant minds, beautiful souls, taken too soon. May they rest in peace, and may we never forget that behind every victim is a person who was loved, who had dreams, who deserved to live." The memorial has become a place of pilgrimage for families of missing persons, for survivors of violence, for anyone who needs a place to remember, to grieve, to hope. Marcus Webb remains in a maximum security prison in California. He's housed in protective custody, segregated from the general prison population for his own safety. Prison officials confirm that inmates have threatened him multiple times. Prisoners don't take kindly to those who prey on young women, especially not in such horrific ways. He spends 23 hours a day in his cell, a small concrete box with a bed, a toilet, and nothing else. 1 hour a day, he's allowed out for recreation in an isolated exercise yard where he walks in circles alone. According to prison reports, he still maintains he was conducting legitimate scientific research. He writes letters constantly to scientific journals, trying to get his findings published, to legal organizations, claiming his conviction violated his academic freedom, to anyone who might listen. They're all rejected, of course, thrown away, ignored. But he persists, writing page after page about his theories, his experiments, his conviction that history will eventually vindicate him. In his mind, he's still a misunderstood genius, a martyr to science, persecuted by a society too small-minded to appreciate his work. He will die in that cell, alone, unmourned, forgotten by everyone except the families whose lives he destroyed. And that perhaps is the only justice we can offer to Jessica, Aisha, Nicole, Samantha, Rachel, Lily, and Elena. Dr. Marcus Webb was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder, 7 counts of kidnapping, 7 counts of torture, 7 counts of unlawful imprisonment, multiple counts of abuse of a corpse, violations of medical ethics laws, practicing medicine without proper authorization, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 175 years for additional charges. Final tribute. Elena Martinez was 26 years old when she died. She loved the ocean, loved learning, loved life. She wanted to make the world better through her research on marine conservation. She had her mother's smile and her father's determination. She called home every Sunday. She dreamed of swimming with dolphins, of discovering new species, of making a difference. Instead, she endured 129 days of unimaginable torture at the hands of a man she trusted, a man who was supposed to guide her, mentor her, help her achieve her dreams. Jessica Palmer wanted to save sharks. Aisha Robinson wanted to heal sick animals. Nicole Chen wanted to unlock the mysteries of the deep ocean. Samantha Torres wanted to protect coral reefs. Rachel Kim wanted to understand how whales think. Lily Anderson wanted to revolutionize sustainable fishing. They all had dreams. They all had families who loved them. They all had futures that were stolen. This is their story, not Marcus Webb's. Not the story of a mad scientist or a groundbreaking experiment gone wrong. This is the story of 7 young women who deserved better, who deserved to live, to love, to achieve their dreams, to grow old, to make the world better. Instead, they became victims of a monster who saw them as nothing more than test subjects, as means to his own twisted ends. We remember them, we honor them, and we fight to ensure that what happened to them never happens again. Their lives mattered. Their dreams mattered. They mattered. Rest in peace, Elena, Jessica, Aisha, Nicole, Samantha, Rachel, and Lily. You are not forgotten. You will never be forgotten.